I wanted to ask you about this idea that we hear a lot, which I believe to be 100% true, which is when it comes to the Israelis, every accusation is in fact a confession. And I think one of the most insidious examples of this is the argument that Hamas uses Palestinians as human shields, because this is the one that, for all the time that I've followed this issue and understood it, that's all I've ever heard. And it's not just, it's all Arabs. We just love to use our babies as human shields because we hate our children, I guess. So, of course, the irony here is that actually it's Israel that uses Palestinians as human shields. Over and over and over again, they've had like an evolution of policy in this. So I'm curious if you can walk us through that, because I think it's really important to understand that Israel has had an actual military policy of using Palestinians as civilians as human shields to protect their soldiers when they're carrying out military operations.
2008, 2009, in the first war Israel waged on Gaza, in which it killed more than 1,000 Palestinians. Again, you have multiple reports, a dozen some reports of during that ground operation, Israeli soldiers grabbing Palestinians, entering homes with the Palestinians used as human shields. We've seen this in the past few years. It's become almost, you have like Israeli soldiers will, dress up as doctors and enter a Palestinian hospital in Jenin or Nablus, right, as if they were doctors, right? So and then in Gaza, over the past 11 months, we have now a Haaretz report. So this is in the open now. Israeli military sources are acknowledging it. They're entering, in order for them to enter these tunnels, they grab Palestinian civilians to enter the tunnels first, so that in case they're booby-trapped, it's the Palestinians who die, not the Israeli soldiers. I mean, should this come as any surprise to anyone? An army that's killed 40,000 plus Palestinians, 15,000 plus children at least, those are the official counts, that the actual number is much higher, that this army is going to have total disregard for Palestinian civilian life? It's absolutely despicable. This is not just Palestinians who are used as human shields, it's Israelis who are used as human shields as well.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. 11 months of genocide in Gaza, and there are still people justifying it. Despite the systematic rape, the mass murder, the land theft, and the apocalyptic destruction Israel has unleashed on Palestinians, Israel's supporters are proudly making excuses. Others are more open about their support for these measures as a righteous form of punishment that they enjoy dishing out against the people they've been primed to hate. And then there are the middle of the road types who only support Palestinians if they die silently, while always condemning them as terrorists if they dare to fight back. How did it get this bad? The dehumanization of Palestinians didn't happen overnight. Neither did this level of genocidal hatred that's consumed Israeli Jewish society, to the point that some of them fantasize publicly about pressing a genocide button to exterminate every single Palestinian. What's the history of Israel's genocidal ambitions and the indoctrination that it requires? Is Zionism really about protecting Jews, or does it actually pose a danger to them? What's the history of Gaza and Hamas and the timeline of Israel's violence against them? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Zachary Foster, a historian of Palestine. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Zachary Foster, welcome to Dispatches.
Rania, thanks so much for having me.
It's great to have you on. I've been wanting to have you on for a really long time because I love your work. I've been following it, especially since October. And I think a good place to start would be, I just want to know a little bit about you because I think you have a bit of an interesting backstory. Obviously, you're an expert, a historian in Palestine. You also announced, I saw recently, that you're about to launch a course on the history of Zionism, which I'm sure is going to be really interesting. And we can talk a little bit about the history of Zionism in a bit. But I'm just curious, you often speak in your interviews as somebody who grew up in a Jewish environment, in a Zionist environment. And I'd like for you to tell our audience a bit about what you grew up understanding about Israel-Palestine and then your evolution to where you are now, because I think it's quite difficult to grow up around around a sort of Zionist narrative and break out of that?
It is very difficult. Most of my childhood friends, most of my family did not grow out of it. They're all very Zionist. I think maybe in the past 11 months, things have begun to change. But in my case, my environment was super Zionist, super Jewish, Jewish summer camps, Jewish schools, Jewish youth groups. I went to Israel with my Jewish youth group. Everything was about Israel. Like Judaism and Israel were sort of two sides of the same coin. To be Jewish meant to be pro-Israel. To be Jewish meant to be a Zionist. You didn't even notice it, right? It just was part of Judaism, right? You would celebrate Israel's Independence Day for the same reason you would celebrate Passover or Rosh Hashanah, right? You would raise an Israeli flag for the same reason you would raise an American flag, right? You you would celebrate Israel's Independence Day. You would take trips to Israel, donate to the IDF, friends of the IDF. This is all part of Judaism. I remember in 2006. This was during, I was an undergraduate student at the University of Michigan. I had already started to evolve my views, was reading a lot of the new Israeli historiography, people like Ilan Pappé. And I was in Shul Saturday morning. They're passing out flyers to donate to the Friends of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, in synagogue on a Saturday morning during the Israel-Hezbollah war of 2006. And that was kind of, I think, one of the first moments where I realized, what happened to American Judaism? This isn't Judaism. This is Zionism. And I think that pushed me further and further in the direction of, wanting to learn Arabic, wanting to study Palestinian history, wanting to spend more time in Palestine, wanting to understand what is happening on the ground to Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, in 48 Palestine, in Israel, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't imagine that would be easy and it makes me sad. It makes me sad that it seems as though Zionism has really been sort of infused into Jewish life in the US in such an extreme way. Like, look, I grew up around a lot of Jewish kids as well. I went to lots of bar mitzvahs, and Israel didn't seem like a center of a lot of their lives. But I remember being confronted with like one kid who I was friends with, like maybe back in middle school or something, who had like come back from that summer. And when you start school, and you go to class and the icebreaker is like, so what did you do this summer? And everybody went around. And this kid who I was friends with was like, oh, I just got back from Israel. And I remember my heart, like my stomach dropped because, I'm Lebanese. I grew up in a family that, I was taught, I grew up going to Palestine protests. I understood the issue from a very young age. And I just my stomach dropped and I got so angry. And I remember we would just get into shouting matches about it. And then we couldn't be friends anymore. Because of that issue. And it just makes me really sad that like an entire culture is distorted by this ideology at this point. However, that said, I've always also, like, as I grew up and learned more about this issue, I always was fascinated by how there is this history of anti-Zionist Jewish activism. And that Zionism isn't even something that necessarily was popular among Jews before the creation of Israel, or maybe even a little bit after it. So I'm curious if you could maybe talk a bit about that history. And I imagine that might be in some of your history of Zionism course, is the history of anti-Zionist activism and attitudes among Jews in the West.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic and one that I think most Zionists don't want people to know about. It's a buried history, intentionally buried, because Zionists want you to believe that Judaism and Zionism are the same thing, right? That Zionism is just the 3,000-year manifestation of Judaism itself, which is obviously nonsense. When Zionism first came onto the scene in the 19th century, by the way, first it was a Christian phenomenon before it was a Jewish phenomenon. It started as really dates, I would say, to the 16th, 17th century in England, where you have this movement of theologians who start to think that through a literal reading of the Bible, right, that look, there are all these prophecies in the Bible that are going to come true eventually, one of which is the Jewish ingathering of the exiles and the return to Palestine and the second coming of the Christ, in which if the Jews don't accept Christ as their Lord and Savior, they will all burn in hell for all eternity, right? And that idea gets carried through in 17th century England, 18th century England, 19th century Britain. You have in 1830s and 40s, you have a very active movement of Protestant Christians who are basically advocating for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. This is decades and decades before Jewish Zionism appears on the scene, which was your question. So let me get to that. But basically, beginning in the 1880s, you have these movement, you have the emergence of these kind of Zionist clubs around Eastern Europe, who are basically saying, we should move to Palestine and establish agricultural colonies. And at first, this is treated with a great deal of hostility among the Jews of Europe. And the Jews of Britain are basically saying, look, we're here for the past century. We've been trying to integrate into Britain. We've been trying to become British citizens. We're British just like every other British citizen. And that's why after the 1917 Balfour Declaration, actually the Jews of Britain organized hundreds of British intellectuals, British leaders organized a movement in Britain, in the United States, to reject Zionism. In 1885, you have the Pittsburgh Platform, which is the Americans' kind of American Reform Judaism. They say straight out, we do not support a movement of Jews to Palestine. We want to become American, just like every other American. Why are you telling us we belong in Palestine? No, we belong in the United States, just like every other American. You have obviously, so you have the kind of secular, kind of assimilationist anti-Zionist Jews. You obviously have the religious anti-Zionist Jews who say, look, we've seen this type of phenomenon before. We have many ultra-Orthodox Jews in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And that movement of ultra-Orthodox Jews continues to this day, right? With the Neturei Karta and with the Satmar Hasidim, 100,000 Jews today, Orthodox Jews who say, not in our name, don't want to have anything to do with the Zionist movement. And the reason is very simple, which is that in traditional halakha, according to kind of traditional Jewish halachic authorities, the rabbis, they basically say that you cannot pull forward the future. You have to, basically, the Jews also have these eschatological fantasies about the end of days. And they believe actually as well that Jews will gather in Palestine at the end of days. But only God can decide when that time comes. And by trying to pull that future forward, you are playing God's role. You are doing something that only can come through divine intervention. And thus you're heretical. It's not just that we don't want to have anything to do with this. It's that you are actively carrying out a heresy against Jewish law. So that's kind of, let's say, a second strain of Jewish anti-Zionism. A third strain would be a kind of humanitarian approach. And you have Jews already in 1919 saying, this is an American historian, an American Orientalist. That's how he was known at the time, right? Orientalism in the kind of non-pejorative sense that he's a historian of the Middle East, let's say, of Islamic studies. He says, in 1919, publishes a book where he says, it's already obvious that you cannot create a Jewish state in Palestine. Why? Because there's Muslims in Palestine, there are Christians in Palestine, there's a dozen some national groups in Palestine. And if you create a state based around just one national group, you're going to obviously, that will obviously have negative implications for all the other groups in Palestine. And he was exactly right. And that's exactly, a century later, here we are facing a genocide against those other groups.
Yeah, it's really just like very predictable sort of situation. And people did actually predict it and they opposed it. And there is a very deep history of Jewish leftism that was opposed to it that you kind of see coming out again today. I actually wanted to show, this kind of reminded me, because I think you can speak more to this because I'm not in the Jewish community, but I see these conversations playing out and you're sometimes involved in them. But just to set it up, so there was a woman who won an award for like best director. And she gave a really lovely speech where when she went to go collect her award, she said in front of this whole audience that Israel's committing genocide in Gaza and we should oppose it. And she was speaking as a Jewish person. And so I'm just going to show that real quick. And then I want to show your response to this person that shared it. So here we go. Here is somebody called Raylan Givens. And this is the woman who's accepting the award. It was really beautiful what she said. It's very short. I'll play it real quick and then.
As a Jewish American artist working in a time-based medium, I must note, I'm accepting this award on the 336th day of Israel's genocide in Gaza and 76th year of occupation. I believe it is our responsibility as film workers to use the institutional platforms through which we work to redress Israel's impunity on the global stage. I stand in solidarity with the people of Palestine in their struggle for liberation.
So that was so beautiful, so brave, because we've seen that no matter who you are, no matter what your identity is, you're going to get a psychotic backlash from Zionists. And here's one of them saying, this is what, I'm just so stunned by this language. This person, Raylan, said, this is what a capo looks like. A disgrace to our people and a traitor. Make no mistake. She is not our people. Sarah Friedland, her name, sees her Jewishness, or says her Jewishness, or uses her Jewishness, I guess was typo there, to sharply attack Israel for the genocide in Gaza, 76 years of occupation. She expresses full sympathy with Palestinians. She calls on the audience of artists to act against Israel through the institutionalized platforms through which they work. So then to that, you then responded, Raylan, you're a genocidal maniac and a disgrace to the Jewish people. Crawl into a cave and never show your face in public, and the Jewish people will be much better off without you. So I do appreciate your passion there. But the reason I wanted to show this is because I think it speaks to an internal struggle that's happening inside your community right now. And I was just curious if you can talk a bit to that, because this does seem like, in many ways, like right-wing Zionists versus left-wing Jews. And they're trying to not just cancel you, but literally strip you of your Jewish identity. And I'm just curious how that makes you feel and where you see that going.
There's a principle in Judaism which says that if you've saved one life, you've saved the entire world. There's another principle in Judaism which says that standing on one foot, in the Pirkei Avot, in the there's a very popular religious text known as Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the Father, in which I believe it's Rabbi Hillel is asked, summarize the entire Torah on one foot, and he says, "Ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha." Treat your neighbor like you would like to be treated. Okay, so kind of if you have to boil down Judaism to its kind of core essence, its core meaning, it's be a good person, treat other people the way you want to be treated, and don't ever kill anyone. And so that's Judaism in a nutshell. Okay, so could there be something more anti-Jewish than what Israel is doing to the Palestinians right now? It's a complete violation of the essence of Judaism. So there's nothing more anti-Jewish than being pro-genocide. There's nothing more anti-Jewish than being pro-Israel's war on Gaza. And so to see this guy say, oh, you're a capo for calling out Israel's genocide is just an absolute disgrace in my view. And it's a disgrace to the Jewish people. And if you look back in history and you look at, Jewish movements, Jews were some of the most leftist, the most progressives in the Soviet Union, in Germany, in the UK, in the US. I mean, look around, like who are the most vocal anti-genocide activists in the US? They're the JVP activists, taking over the rotunda in the US Capitol, shutting down bridges and train stations, right? They're the most vocal, they're the most active, because we have a long-standing tradition in the Jewish community of activism, of social justice, of equal rights. And to see the state of Israel acting in our name, carrying out a genocide, is just absolutely despicable. And then to see these people calling the anti-genocide Jewish activists cabos, I mean, what is there even what do you even say to that? Just crawl into a hole and disappear.
Yeah. And I also think you touched on something that I'd like you to elaborate on, and that's the issue of the threat that Israel actually does pose to Jews around the world. And I think it's interesting, given that Israel obviously promotes itself as like, we have to exist. Zionism is all about, Jewish safety. That's the way it's promoted, at least in the West, is it's about Jewish safety. You guys committed a Holocaust against us. That can never happen again. And that's why we need to have this safe haven on other people's land, and on and on and on. But actually, it just seems to me twofold here. On the one hand, Israel does pose an actual threat because it's such a violent country. It needs to be violent in order to, have a Jewish majority. If that's what's required in a place that's not historically majority Jewish, you have to commit huge acts of violence, and they're doing it in the name of Judaism. And so that leads to anti-Jewish attitudes. And then on top of that, you have Israel basically, and Zionism in general, distorting, like we talked about, like kind of distorting Jewish cultural institutions to shift their focus to support for Israel. And then to go even further, I also think this is in many ways, and maybe I'm getting a bit abstract here, but Israel is an arm of US imperialism in the Middle East. And to me, it looks like you have the biggest empire, most violent empire in history, the United States, using Jews around the world as like human shields for empire, in a horrific way, because they're basically throwing them on a front line, and then, making them kill and die so America control a region. So yeah, I'm just curious your thoughts. Take any of those you want to and go with it.
Yeah, I very much agree that Jews have sacrificed their lives in the name of protecting Jews. I mean, just try and wrap your head around that idea. Jews need to die so Jews can be safe. If you go back into the history of Zionism, you see at every turn, Jews were asked to sacrifice their lives. I mean, let's start with the period, the British Mandate period. Hundreds and hundreds of Jews died in political violence. Trying to take over Palestine, right? There were, it's like the classic case of a Zionist colony being established through the process of displacing the native inhabitants would lead to an outbreak of violence. I mean, they knew this from the very beginning. Zev Jabotinsky's Iron Wall in 1923, he said it outright. These people consider themselves the native inhabitants of the land. They're not going to give it up. They're not going to leave. They're not going to abandon their sources of livelihood so that we can have an ethno-national state. That's just never going to happen. So they knew what they were getting involved in. Everyone knew. Ben-Gurion knew. Jabotinsky knew. Golda Meir knew. They all knew what this project involved. It involved displacing the native inhabitants who were going to resist, which meant you were going to have to carry out acts of violence, which is exactly what happened in 1948 when 6,000 Zionist soldiers slash civilians, it was a mix, but basically about 6,000, which was 1% of the Jewish community of Palestine, perished in 1948 war. Guess why? Ethnic cleansing is dangerous. Obviously for the victims, but also for the perpetrators. When you are going around village to village, committing indiscriminate slaughter, carrying out these massacres in Tantura, in Deir Yassin, in Lid, when you're going around expelling Palestinians from their homes in a systematic way over the course of a 12-month period, guess what? That will be very dangerous for you and your community. And so the Jews who fled persecution in Europe and found safe haven in United States, Canada, Australia, UK, Western Africa, Argentina, Peru, those Jews fared much, much better than the Jews who wound up in Palestine, where they were subject to political violence, where they were killed in the process of carrying out these atrocities. That was true in 48. It was true in 56 when Israel engaged in a neo-colonial war to reoccupy Gaza and the Suez Canal. It was true in 67 when Israel engaged in a war of choice to conquer Sinai, the Golan Heights, West Bank, and Gaza. It was true in 1982 when Israel, again, in a war of choice, invaded Lebanon, as you well know very well. It happened again during the first Intifada. It happened in the second Intifada. It happened in every single one of Israel's wars on Gaza in 2008, 9, in 2012, in 2014, 2021. They were all wars of choice, just like the current one. Every single war is a war of choice. And you have to ask yourself, how many Jews need to die in the name of keeping Jews safe? And you see in the current war, the current genocidal war on Gaza, a December 2023 report out of Israeli trauma centers identified 10,000 Israeli soldiers had been either killed or wounded or traumatized. We're talking thousands and thousands of Jews losing their limbs, permanently disabled, they couldn't handle this number of cases. It's been 9 months since December. How many more Jews and Israeli soldiers need to die in the name of carrying out the mass murder of the Palestinian people? Forgetting about the Palestinians, let's suppose you're a Jewish supremacist. Let's suppose all you care about is Jews. How is this in the interest of the Jewish people?
It's certainly not. And it really, I mean, there's also the moral decay of an entire society where it's, I think that it's like you're not surprised that Israeli society is this consumed by hate. It's nonetheless still shocking that people can be this like kind of egomaniacally genocidal. I'll put it like that. And I'm going to give two examples of this because I want to talk a little bit about Israeli Jewish society and just how consumed by a desire to exterminate Palestinians they have become. So one is there's the religious side of it. There's this guy, Meir Mazuz. He's a top Israeli rabbi who is said to be favored by Netanyahu and his cabinet. And he recently, I'm not going to play the video because it's in Hebrew, so our audience isn't going to understand it. But in this video, he basically on video blesses Israeli soldiers that gang raped a Palestinian that was abducted from Gaza. And I'm going to directly quote this rabbi. He says, "You beat the enemy, so what? It's all good. Don't we have the right to do it? In any other country, they'd get medals. Don't fear the goyim." So there's that side of Israeli society, which is like that sort of right-wing, ultra-nationalist, ultra-Zionist side, ultra-religious side of things. And then and I know you've seen this, but I'm going to play it anyway because it's worth playing again. It was the Two Nice Jewish Boys podcast that I was, I got to say, I was really stunned that these two podcasters were willing to openly fantasize the way they did about genocide. There's the clip where he talks about wanting to push a genocide button. And then there's another clip that didn't get as much attention, but got some attention about just like enjoying a concert more because knowing Palestinians were in what they called Nakba tents. So I'm just going to play a little bit of this.
Doing it
to appease
it's because we're looking for international legitimacy. No one actually gives a shit. Zero people in Israel, if you go up to them and you're like, do you care if this baby in Gaza gets polio? They'll be like, I don't fucking just
if Oppenheimer would care.
Yeah, okay, there'll be like 20 people who care and they're all wearing Meretz shirts. Like, fuck them. But seriously, nobody would give a shit. They'd be like, leave me alone, man. I'm trying to like buy
Eat
shit
ice cream
for Shabbat. Like, fuck off. I don't care about this Gazan kid with polio.
Also, as long as they're in their Nakba state in their tents, and we're living still, like, if you put aside the news, day to day is okay. Yesterday we went to a concert in Erkon Park. We had lots of fun, me and my girlfriend. Shalom Chanoch. We danced. And it was amazing, and you can't help but think like it's nice to know that you're dancing in a concert while hundreds of thousands of Gazans are,
Homeless,
like sitting in a tent and eating.
Makes it even better.
Yeah,
more enjoyable concert. If only they put the
live video
footage of Gaza. Like, but seriously, you guys like that. That's what people don't understand. Look, like, I know that you guys might be appalled by this, some of the listeners, but seriously, this is how Israelis feel. And you might think that Eitan Weinstein and Naor, who like refuses to kind of back me up on it publicly.
I'm from the UN.
Yeah, he's the UN. But you might think I'm extreme. But I have conversations with lots of people, coworkers, friends. People enjoy knowing that they are suffering.
No, also it's very prominent on Twitter.
So I've watched that clip so many times, and each time I watch it, I'm still blown away. But I do also appreciate the honesty, I guess. But that's not a natural sentiment for people to have. That is a learned sentiment. So obviously, Israel was founded on a massive campaign of like murder and ethnic cleansing. And I'm not suggesting it was founded not hating Palestinians, but this seems to be like a special sort of new level that Israeli society has reached. So I'm just curious, how did we get to that, where you've got this rabbi saying something so disgusting about why it's okay to gang rape Palestinians, and then you've got these two guys, I don't know if they're secular or not, but they kind of present as like bro-y and secular to some degree, openly fantasizing about Palestinian suffering, and it makes them feel better in life. How did we get there?
I mean, there's so much to say about this. The turn towards genocide, not just at a political level, but at a societal level, where you have Jewish podcasters openly speaking about the benefits of genocide and how it's a joyous occasion for them to carry out ethnic cleansing. I mean, let's go back to the origins of the Zionist movement. Okay, Zionism had nothing to do with Palestinians. They were completely irrelevant to the project. The project was, let's build an exclusively Jewish ethno-national state in Palestine. Exclusively Jewish. There was no attempt in the 1920s, or not, very briefly in the 1920s, but basically by the 1930s and 40s, there was no attempt to try and bring Palestinians, bring the native inhabitants of Palestine into the Zionist project. They were irrelevant. They were, to the extent that they accepted Jewish domination in Palestine, they were accepted. To the extent that they accepted political subjugation, they were allowed to remain in Palestine. That was the view taken by every Zionist leader, was if they accept them, and even in the 48 war, they would show up to a village like, if you accept Zionist domination, maybe we won't expel you. Maybe we will anyways, because we still need a majority Jewish. But the point is, if Palestinians show any resistance whatsoever, nonviolent, violent, BDS, it doesn't make any difference. The form of resistance that Palestinians take, if they resist the project of Jewish domination in Palestine, they have a few options. They can they will face expulsion. That's sort of number one. But if they refuse to leave their homes, well, guess what? Guess what fate they will face? They will face genocide. And that is kind of, I think, at the core of this genocidal turn in Israeli society is this idea that Israel is a Jewish state. And Israel is meant to protect and serve Jews. I mean, we've already talked about how that's a myth. But basically, that is the self-perception, is that this is all about protecting the Jews, saving the Jews, Jewish development, Jewish prosperity, Jewish safety, Jewish security. Where are Palestinians? Where are Palestinians? They're just not part of the story. They're completely irrelevant. And then when you consider an Israeli Jew born in the state of Israel, grows up, going to primary school, being told their entire lives, one day they're going to they're going to serve in the IDF and defend the Jewish state. And then their entire adult life, they serve in reserve duty, right? So it's a citizen army. Israel and the IDF, the citizenry in Israel and the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli military, they're kind of two sides of the same coin, right? You have 450,000 reservists in the Israeli army. That's like 10% of the Jewish population of the country serves in the army as a reservist. I mean, just imagine how many Americans would be the equivalent would be, where you would be talking about tens of millions of Americans serving in reserve duty. Right? So what you have is an entire society that feels that is essentially part of the army. If you take Israel's definition, I mean, just one quick point. Israel in Gaza claims that it is willing. It basically, when it targets Hamas fighters, right? Israel, there was a 972 reporting that confirmed this from Israeli military sources, in which basically Israel would prefer to wait for a Hamas fighter to go home, and then they would attack the home, because that way they would they would basically kill, and they're willing to kill as many as 20 civilians for every one Hamas fighter they kill. That's the official ratio that's tolerable, I guess, that they're willing to pass through the military censor. But for a senior commander, they're willing to kill hundreds, as many as 500, 300 to 500 in some cases for a senior Hamas fighter. Okay, now do the math on the Israeli side. What if Hamas took that same attitude of, and that we are going to wait for every Israeli soldier to go home, and then when they get home, we're willing to kill 20 Israeli civilians for every low-level Israeli soldier, and we're going to kill 500 Israeli civilians for every high-level Israeli official that we kill. And if Hamas took that same calculation, then literally every single Israeli would be a target. There would be an entire society, all 9 million Israelis would be legitimate targets.
And you could imagine how the media would cover that, by the way. Could you imagine like Dana Bash and Jake Tapper being like totally fine with that ratio if Hamas carried it out the way they are when Israel does? Probably not. I have a feeling they wouldn't be. But no, that's a really good point. And this is, I think, a good segue maybe into the Palestinian side of things, because obviously Palestinians have a right to armed resistance, as any people under occupation do. And so I don't want to sit here and act like a lot of the corporate media personalities do sometimes, where Palestinians are only like worthy of sympathy if they die silently, or as innocently as possible, because that kind of sometimes seems like the only way we're allowed to sympathize with Palestinians, if it's like a child who was killed, and then we really can't say they're killers. That said, Palestinians do have a history of nonviolent resistance. You did a really, really good thread on this. So I'm curious if you could maybe give us a brief walkthrough of the history of Palestinian nonviolent resistance and the Israeli reaction to that nonviolent resistance.
Palestinians have been embracing nonviolent resistance for decades. I mean, really, it goes back to the 1920s, when, in the aftermath of the Balfour Declaration, right, the Palestinian community met every single year: 1919, 1921, 1922, 1925, 1922, 1926. And they passed resolutions declaring their opposition to Zionism. They passed resolutions saying the British should establish a democratic state in Palestine, whose elected representatives would come from the Arabic-speaking peoples of Palestine, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, before World War I. And that was the approach taken by Palestinians for a decade and a half. And guess what happened? It failed miserably. And the British continued to promote Zionist immigration, which eventually blew over in the one of the greatest anti-colonial revolts in all of colonial history. From 1936 to 1939, Palestinians rose up. But again, this started as a nonviolent political movement that failed, and thus it turned violent. And that's the trend, right? It's Palestinians start. You always, when you're resisting domination and occupation and oppression, you always start nonviolently, right? And that's what happened. That's what the Palestinians did in 1987. After 20 years of Israeli military occupation, in which Israel is killing 32 Palestinians every year for 20 years, in which Israel is expelling hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from the occupied territories from 67 to 87, something like 250,000 Palestinians lose their right to be occupied Palestinians because they left for more than 3 years, and thus they were not allowed to come back to be an occupied Palestinian. Right? For 20 years, Israel's denying Palestinians basic rights, the right to vote for the government that controls their lives, right? The right to wave a Palestinian flag, the right to paint a painting using red, using red, green, black, and white. Palestinians have no rights. They're occupied peoples. What happens? Revolt. Nonviolent revolt. From late 1987 until 1988, you have the Israeli army goes into Gaza and tries to suppress this nonviolent uprising of Palestinians in the streets, protesting, burning tires, passing out leaflets, kids throwing stones at tanks, right? Basically nonviolent, certainly unarmed resistance. In the first year of that resistance, the Israeli military enters Gaza and kills 142 Palestinians and suffers 0 casualties because it wasn't nonviolent uprising. And that is one of the key factors that leads Palestinian movements to embrace a violent struggle, a militant resistance struggle. So that's kind of the first major episode in which the nonviolent movement failed because Israel suppressed it with brutality. I mean, Yitzhak Rabin told his soldiers, break the bones of the Palestinian kids. And so you had 10,000 Palestinian kids with broken bones. And about 20% of those kids who had broken bones were under the age of 5 years old. You're telling me a 5-year-old kid is a threat to you, and so you need to break his arm. So this is the nature of Israeli violence and Palestinian resistance. And by the way, the nonviolent movements continued, right? You could even claim Oslo, the entire Oslo process. This is a political process. This is all about nonviolence. What happened with Oslo? Israel massively expanded its settlement enterprise, continued to take over more Palestinian land. Tens of thousands of dunams of Palestinian land continue to be taken throughout the Oslo process, at a time when Palestinians are saying, we gave up armed struggle, we are here at the diplomatic table, and you're still taking more Palestinian land. And then I think really, if you go back, I mean, we could give so many examples of Palestinian nonviolent struggle, and every single movement is dealt with violence. I mean, go back to the early 2000s after the construction of the wall. When Israel decided, we know the solution to Palestinian resistance, we're going to build a wall, right? That always solves the problem. What happens? Dozens of Palestinian villages, Nelain, Belain, Nabi Saleh, now Beitah, basically start protesting the confiscation of their lands. And what does Israel do? Village by village, goes in, starts sniping Palestinians. Bassam Abu Rahman, slaughtered with the tear gas canister shot to his chest from point blank range in 2010. What did he do? He raised a Palestinian flag and protested nonviolently, and he was slaughtered for that. And the same thing happened in 2018. When in March 2018, tens of thousands of Palestinian activists in Gaza said, enough is enough. The siege on Gaza is unacceptable. Gaza is becoming unlivable. You've suffocated our lives. You've enslaved us. You've besieged us. We're going to protest. Tens of thousands of Palestinians descend to the wall every week from March 2018 to May 2018. Tens of thousands of Palestinians, protesting, raising Palestinian flags, demanding the right of return. What does Israel do in return? Slaughters dozens and dozens of them. And then on a single day, on May 14th, 2018, the Israeli army and Israeli snipers gunned down 61 Palestinians on a single day. And so that's what happens when you resist nonviolently. You get slaughtered. And I think that helps explain how we got to where we got to today.
But, I remember, I can't remember, this is like me mixing up annoying columnists, but I can't remember if it was David Brooks or Thomas Friedman. It was one of them years ago, wrote in a column about Palestinians. And it was like, if only they all just got up and with basically their hands up and no weapons, march to the wall and just let Israel shoot them. The world would suddenly care and everything would be fine. And the occupation would end tomorrow. And I'm like, that's literally what they did in the March of Return. They marched every single day for a very, very long time and got their kneecaps blown off. And a lot of them were killed too. And I never heard from, I'm sorry if I'm, David Brooks and Thomas Friedman, they're just like cardboard cutouts to me of like the same kind of obnoxious sort of centrist columnist who writes for one of these major outlets that they sound the same to me. I can't tell them apart. But the point is it's like Palestinians don't get any, they don't get any accolades for any of their nonviolent resistance. And then when they resist violently, which I want to again say, they actually have a right to resist violently against that kind of violence. They are called terrorists. And then on top of that, Israel will use this framing, and they do it with the Lebanese as well, where when we're talking about either like Hamas or Hezbollah, it's always, well, the reason we hate these groups isn't because they're Palestinians, because they're Islamic terrorists, right? They're like religious psychotic Islamists. And also, on top of that, like, if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be having to do this in Gaza. If it wasn't for Hezbollah, we wouldn't have to be doing this in Lebanon. When the reality of the situation is that before Hezbollah existed, before Hamas existed, when there was a secular resistance, when there was a leftist resistance, where there was women included even, there was like secular women resistance. Israel still shot and killed them. Israel still went and bombed Lebanon and invaded before Hezbollah existed. It stole Palestinian land before Hamas existed. And all that's to say, I'm actually curious, can you walk us through, because you did a really good thread on this, the history of Hamas? I guess a brief history, because obviously we could sit here all day and talk about the history of Hamas, but in particular, the fact that Hamas arose not at the beginning of Israel's creation, it arose over time, but its founders actually have a history that led them to becoming the founders of Hamas. And then people in Hamas today have a history that led them to becoming, like Yahya Sinwar has a specific history that led him down the road of where he is today as now the leader of Hamas. So yeah, can you talk a bit about that history? Because I think it's important when we talk about this group that gets so much attention and constantly compared to ISIS, because it's not ISIS and it has a very complex history.
That's exactly correct. In 1948, Israel expelled Sheikh Ahmed Yassin from his home when he was 13 years old in what is now southern Israel. He became a refugee in Gaza. He became the co-founder of Hamas 3 decades later. Wow, who would have guessed? A kid who experienced childhood trauma ended up becoming enthralled with kind of resistance to Israeli domination. The second co-founder of Hamas, Abdul Aziz Rantisi, when he was 8 years old, in Khan Yunis in 1956, Israel entered his village, rounded up every male above the age of 15, lined them up on November 2nd, 1956, and slaughtered them. 150, and including his uncle. Oh, wow, guess what happened to him? He also became a resistance leader. So this has been the trend.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.